So over the last few weeks, we've seen across the United States, but also elsewhere, student encampments protesting against Israel's genocidal onslaught against Gaza. I'm actually here in Dublin, and I was here at an encampment which was victorious, Trinity College Dublin. They demanded that the university authorities divest from Israeli companies, including those directly linked, I should say, to the illegal settlements in the West Bank. After 5 days of that encampment, the authorities gave in and accepted the demands. Now, in the United States, this was a point the protest leaders here in Dublin made, we've seen brutal repression, both a combination of police attacks on these encampments, as well as pro-Israel thugs, which for example, in Los Angeles, came in brutally and basically rioted whilst the police looked on and attacked students. Now, one of these encampments is at UPenn, which is obviously an extremely prestigious university in the United States. Their encampment was set up on the 25th of April. Now, yesterday in the early hours, they were subjected to the police, including riot cops in riot gear, storming in, engaging in a mass arrest. Let's just see a clip now from what happened at UPenn.
We will not stop. We will not rest. It's go.
I'm really delighted to be joined by Dagmawi, who is a faculty member, and Eliana, who is a sophomore, young undergraduate member, as I suppose we would say in the British context. Anyways, delighted to speak to you both. How are you both doing?
Great.
We're doing well, as well as one could be under these circumstances.
So you're in a hotel lobby just near where the encampment was, over in the glorious state of Pennsylvania. Okay, let's just talk about it. So firstly, this encampment. So let's just go back to basics here. Why are these student encampments important?
Yeah, so we began the encampment and we have 3 demands that have remained throughout the entirety. 1, to disclose investments from the University of Pennsylvania. 2, to divest from companies profiting off of Israeli genocide in Gaza. And 3, to defend Palestinian scholarship, to defend pro-Palestinian speech on campus. We had set up the encampment with a goal to get these demands met. And as we've seen, the university has met us with violence and aggression, and it is a real travesty that has happened.
Don't worry. I mean, you're a faculty member, and obviously we've seen faculty members involved and supportive of the action students have taken at campuses, both in the United States and elsewhere. From your perspective, why is this so important?
Well, it's crucial. On the one hand, I mean, personally, to speak out when a genocide is taking place. I don't want my silence to translate into complicity. That's one. And secondly, universities are places where critical, substantive conversation takes place. And the university, after October 7th, but even before that, has suppressed speech having to do with Palestine. It's taken numerous actions, right? So as faculty members, we thought as an academic university, it has to meet this obligation where critical, honest conversation can happen, and there cannot be a moratorium on Palestine, right? The Palestinian exception to free speech. That's one. And secondly, it is to support our students who are part of the encampment, engaged in an enormous effort to educate the campus when the university failed to do so and actually was taking an active role in suppressing speech. So, that's why many of us as faculty fully supported our students.
It's interesting. There's just been a study by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project as an independent nonprofit. They track political violence and political protests around the world. They found 97% of campus demonstrations over the war in Gaza in the US since mid-April have been peaceful. And by the way, not to denigrate their research, but there's a bit of conflation there because they're actually including property damage, which many wouldn't actually. That's not violence against humans, is it? So what they're talking about there is interpersonal violence or property damage. But at the same time, they say there's been at least 70 instances of forceful police intervention against US campus protests. We also saw the hideous scenes in LA when you saw just pro-Israel thugs rioting, you know, in the most brutal fashion. Yeah, I'm just interested in that because, I've interviewed, actually, for example, I interviewed a Jewish faculty member in Columbia who just emphasized just like, if you actually saw the encampment and the way it's portrayed in the media, like the Gap is like deranged. Just like she was just like, because obviously she, was for her, Jewish safety was obviously very important and paramount. But obviously we had this narrative of the threats to the safety of particularly Jewish students. And she pointed out that obviously Jewish students are often front and center of many of this process. Yeah, just in terms of the way this is portrayed, your encampment and what it actually was. I'm just interested in, you lived through it and then you see how it's reported. What's your sense?
Yeah, my biggest understanding of what the encampment was, especially us being in a university, it was literally a classroom. It was a space where Palestinian scholarship was embraced. It was a space that we students, faculty, community members created in an environment where the university has actively suppressed it. It was a space of learning, of a lot of art, a lot of music, and so much community that, like, just thinking about it makes me very, very wistful even.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very important point that you're making, Owen, because there's a way in which university administrators have kind of framed the narrative of the encampment. Initially started blaming the students, then disparaging them, right? Then demonizing them, and in effect provided the rationale then to unleash police onto a university campus. Now, it's as if, they are top officials, right? So the university president, the university provost, the interim president, and the provost never set a foot on the encampment. If one was there, you would see it was a place of interfaith services taking place. There was a wonderful Passover Seder that was there. The number of scholars, including leading preeminent Jewish scholars who are experts in Holocaust and genocide studies, who came in to talk to students, right? The de-escalation sessions that these students held. So the space actually was one of enormous inclusivity, right? I remember a refrain, just to give you one example, a refrain that I heard again and again was, among the chants was, when counter protesters and hecklers would try to interrupt, we would say, pay it no mind. And someone would explain, this is actually something that Marsha P. Johnson, one of the great activists, trans activists who helped to launch, right, the Stonewall Rebellion, would say, right? So in terms of queer students, Jewish students, because that's something that the university tried to say, talk about our Jewish community as one monolith, right? So the number of Jewish students who are also part of the encampment, and faculty, Jewish faculty, who support them. So a deliberate mischaracterization of the encampment in order to demonize the students. And maybe one other point I would add, because they kept on saying it's a safety risk, right? They're outside forces, it's not just the students. And, all these code words, right, that they were using, that's a different way of than saying this is actually a coalition, a Philadelphia coalition of University of Pennsylvania students, Drexel students, Temple students, right? If you present it that way, then the public would actually have a very different kind of response.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they throw out the words outside agitators to characterize the people in the community that we have built as inherently dangerous. And to that I say, come to the encampment. If you had actually been there, if you had actually seen the food that we had, the spaces that we shared, the music we created, it would have convinced you that we're nothing but peaceful.
I mean, on that, I find it really interesting since 7th October, because for a long time we had this kind of the cancel culture narrative. I would note not many people talking about cancel culture anymore, because the people often talking about cancel culture before were talking about basically the right to say very inflammatory and bigoted things about marginalized minorities who didn't really have a platform, and how if anyone basically pushed back, then they've been cancelled. That was the gist. And in the US, because there is the free speech, kind of obviously that's supposed to be, it's in the Constitution, but which we don't have in the UK. But it's just quite interesting because a lot of people pushing the narrative of cancel culture, the people trying to literally cancel and silence people, which is why they stopped talking about it. And I'm just interested in this because you also got what you're talking about is free speech and the right to be able to just say facts. And I don't quote Ben Shapiro often, a right-wing agitator. A phrase he often said to kind of like troll the left was facts don't care about your feelings. And what we've seen is this really interesting narrative of this is what you're saying is inflammatory and dangerous and hurtful. When what we're talking, and obviously an attempt to end any demarcation between the Israeli state and Jewish people generally, when in the US we see a whole generation of younger Jewish people in particular really taking a stand in the great tradition of the Jewish left. I just want to think about that. It's just, cancel culture, free speech. And yet here we are, peaceful protest, people exercising their right to freedom of expression and assembly, and then riot police are sent in to mass arrest them.
Yeah, I can speak on that, and specifically in terms of the university and the ways that they've treated their own students who have taken a public stance to protesting genocide. I and 5 other students have been forced to take a mandatory leave of absence, but what that means, it's a ban on campus. And in the letter that I received, it said, in extraordinary circumstances, when a student's presence has been deemed a threat to the order, health, and safety and conduct of the university, they will essentially be asked to leave campus. And I am 19 years old. I live in a student dorm. And what that ban meant was that I couldn't access my on-campus housing. I've been locked out of my dorm. I'm not allowed to access any dining hall, the library. And
what's the rationale there?
I still don't know. I received it at 11 a.m., I think 2 days ago now, and that was directly in response to our encampment, I think, expanding to take more of the college green that we were currently on. The next day I received an email. In the email it said, they will aim to give a hearing to allow students to have the opportunity to vouch for themselves. Something along those lines. None of the 6 got that hearing. We woke up one day and were banned from campus. And you see that in that them characterizing us as threats to campus safety, health, and order is a deliberate characterization of us as dangerous. We are not dangerous.
Well, I can see you're very intimidating and aggressive. I can definitely see that.
And we're all taking a stance against genocide, but the choice to characterize us as a threat makes me wonder, what are we a threat to? What are we threatening to? Are we threatening to the systems of oppression that have allowed this genocide to continue? Are we a threat to the donors who feel uncomfortable with how much we have shaken the foundation of the institution? Are we a threat to the change and to the opposition to change?
Yeah, and I would just add, one, these students are exercising their First Amendment protected rights to free speech. That's one, right? And secondly, the university has been making these very specious arguments of how the encampment is violating open expression policies and other university guidelines. Initially, actually, the interim president said, "This is great. We welcome it," right? And then immediately started backtracking. But it goes back to the earlier point about, if you disparage these students enough, right? If you mischaracterize what they've been doing, then you can weaponize your own university policies to take these incredibly extreme, right, punitive actions. The other thing I would say is the university is engaged in a practice of institutional amnesia, right? Because student protests in the American Academy is fundamental, right? When we think about the anti-war campaign and what University of Pennsylvania students actually did to ensure the university is not complicit, right, in that war. And obviously the anti-apartheid divestment campaign, right? In fact, fields in this university that we take for granted, be it Africana studies, women and gender and sexuality studies, these came because students protested. Now, these are kind of, foundational to our intellectual enterprise in the U.S. Academy.
Mhm.
So it seems the university is thinking in a vacuum and practicing amnesia when all it needs to do is actually look at its own history.
Yeah, and something I do want to add is that the university actively celebrates the wins of these protest movements. So we are in a place called College Hall. 2 buildings behind is a old building called Houston Hall, and in it is a massive wall that showcases the progress that the university has made. And on it, we have the Women's Center, which was won through protest. We have the African Studies the Africana Studies program, which was won through protest. The Asian American Studies program won through protest. The LGBT Center won through protest, and it makes me want to beg the institution, remember that you actively pride yourself on this.
Yeah.
In 50 years,
it's interesting. There's a viral tweet which partly sums this up. A liberal is someone who opposes every war except the current war and supports all civil rights movements except the one that's going on right now. Yeah, because obviously now, I wrote about this last week because I was at the Dublin encampment, and everyone looks back at the Vietnam protests now, and you kind of think, well, obviously, people, I think it likes to think, they look back and go, well, obviously the students were more right than the people up against them. But obviously at the time that they were demonized viciously, I would say. Because you get some people now going, well, it was not the same, the Vietnam War protest. It's like, well, they were really, really demonized, actually more than the current ones, I would say, in terms of, because public opinion was very hostile in a way, was more hostile than today. The other is, it's things like, civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was, he's a secular saint now, but he was really hated in the 60s. Yeah, it's just, and again, anti-apartheid movement. I was on TV and this against this pro-Israeli politics, and he was just like reeling out the kind of like red baiting stuff. I was like, yeah, they did this, then else. It's just, people aren't aware, they're just repeating the same lines. This strikes me as more, I guess that's the point. I'm just interested in that kind of like, I think do you think the reason they're acting like this though, what's different from before is, look, when it comes to Israel, if you look at polling, it's been very hard in the US to actually, for a long time, be even critical of Israel. But now more Americans do not think genocide has been committed, including a large majority of Democratic voters and Americans under 45. That's a big shift. And I just think there seems to be a panic here, which is the argument's been won, notwithstanding the horror being meted out to Palestinians on a daily basis. They've lost the argument, and they know that. And this is just desperately flailing around. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it's so easy to rake credit, right? Kind of retroactively, right? This is Eliana's point. And that's certainly the case. You mentioned Nelson Mandela, you mentioned Dr. King, we can go on. Desmond Tutu, who actually came to speak at a certain hour in the 1980s. Mandela was, and members of the ANC, terrorists at a certain hour. Now we celebrate Mandela to be, a kind of noble saint. No doubt about it. But and this is the thing I want to say, though. There's something particular with what's been happening at UPenn, because the kind of repression and demonization began well before October 7th, right? So we had a Palestine Rights Literary Festival at the end of September. And there was so much, and this is a literary festival, mind you, at an academic institution. And donors, including, very wealthy donors, including trustees, put so much pressure to shut that down, an academic event. And in reaction, students actually began to engage in also other demonstrations. So they started what they called a freedom school. Mm-hmm. Right? And bear in mind, our previous university president, Liz McGill, was forced to resign. So too was the head of the board of trustees. These are people with immense amount of power
Mhm.
because of the kind of collusion of right-wing politicians, and also elite donors who tried to suppress speech around anything around Palestine. So the students actually began their activism protests before October 7th. So the encampment was really an extension of something that was happening, uh, you know, um, early in the fall.
Yeah, and it's something I want to add on to that. That was very, very well explained. Is that you can see this physical manifestation of this power imbalance, particularly from donors throughout. I think last semester, our Walnut Street and Spruce Street, the two streets that kind of surround campus, there were these trucks that had people's faces, Liz McGill's face on it, and you see this abuse, this imbalance of power and money through these trucks that kind of paraded around campus and showed us what is okay to talk about, but what is not okay to talk about.
Yeah, students who are doxxed, right? So we have these kind of mobile billboards. These are all we know intimidation tactics by outside forces who have a lot of power. But the problem is the institution, like the university, is also, um, you know, trafficking in its own forms of intimidation, be it using and abusing university policies, right? And not coming to the aid of very vulnerable population of our community, our students. The other thing I want to say too is what these students have taught us, Owen, is that they've actually gone back and looked at university archives to see what their other students of the past have done to ensure the university remains faithful to its mission, right? Faithful to its ideals. So, in terms of the education, like they've educated us in the encampment, for instance, during the Vietnam War, Penn was invested in Dow Chemicals, which was, uh, engaged in like napalm and other
Mhm.
weapons of mass destruction. They forced the university to withdraw funding, right, from engaging or investing in a company engaged in that kind of mass atrocity, right? So, I mean, I credit them again when the university is trying to impose all these repressive tactics. They are saying, can we also look at our own history as a university, right? And and follow that lead, right? Our own institutional past.
Yeah. Talking about institutional past, I remember we were doing research about divestment and the history of that, and that Penn in particular was very slow to divest from South Africa and apartheid. In fact, they only divested from one company, particularly near the end wave of the whole movement to divest. But you can still see these students decades before I was born advocating for the same things, but that we're advocating for, just in different formats. But it's the idea that students for many, many decades and many, many movements have been on the forefront of this change.
Amen.
And
Amen.
to me, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and so many of us as faculty, who've now had a chance over the last 2 weeks, but really over the course of the year, to work, closely with these students and to support them, right? To be faculty advocates. And I have seen, I've been teaching in a university setting for the last 18 years. These are among the finest students I have encountered in the past 7 years of teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. Before that, at Cornell University, some of the finest, right?
Yeah.
The most accomplished, the most brilliant students. If Eliana would tell you the number of student groups that she's engaged in, right? The ways in which she actually carries as an ambassador of the university. So to paint these students as somehow, rabble rousers or all these ways, it's just so false. And let's say what it is. It's egregious.
Beyond doubt. Look, what I would just wrap up by saying is I think the courage of all of you, the students, the US, elsewhere, I think is something I'm in awe of. And I just think what makes this movement undefeatable is the moral clarity. The evil we're up against is so obvious and blatant. It's clear we're going to win. The question is how much suffering on that route is going to be made possible. And we're in a race against time. but these student encampments, you know, my last video had included a speech from the Palestine ambassador in which he spoke proudly of the Palestine flag waving above Columbia University. And these protests, and I speak to Palestinians in Gaza, including in Rafah and elsewhere, and it means the world to them. It's giving them hope. So, yeah, go on. Go. Sorry, go. Sorry,
I was just going to say, also, you know, we are a university. This isn't a corporate entity, right? This isn't a hedge fund. This isn't a private equity shop. This is a university, and we have a different kind of responsibility when all the universities in Gaza have been destroyed.
Exactly.
Right? When over 100 professors have been killed, where over 7,000 students, that's comparable to our entire undergraduate population, they've been killed. As a university, we have a moral duty, right? When scholasticism
we have responsibility
to speak up. So I want to just underline that point.
Everyone, please get this video out. It's so important these videos get out, partly because there's an attempt to intimidate and harass people by making look at what happens to Penn and think, oh no, I don't want to speak out in case this happens to us. They're not giving up. We can't give up. So please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Do share this video. But thank you both to Dagmawi and Eliana. You give me hope, and everyone listening hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.